Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with the second video in this little mini-series that I'm doing, and if you haven't seen my last video, please go and check that out first, because in there I discuss my favorite shades from each palette that I own. But today I'm gonna go through the ones that I don't like so much. I'm gonna pick out my least favorite shade in each palette and swatch them out for you, and at the end of this video we'll also do a comparison of my favorite shades and my least favorite shades. But before we jump into that, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. But let's just start with my palettes. So in here there are a few shades that I don't particularly love, but going through the palette, I think the one that I'm actually going to choose is the shade Cypress Umber. And yes, it is a good darkening up shade, but I don't really use those shades very often. I do more now than I used to, but in this palette that is the shade that I'm going to pick as my least favorite. And there you have Cypress Umber swatched on my hand. The next palette we're going to jump into is my Novena Palette, and in here it was quite hard for me to pick a least favorite shade. The shade I'm going to go with though is one shade that when I first looked at this palette I actually really loved the look of it, but I have used it on my eyes a few times and I just can never make it work for me, and that is the shade Soul right here. It is beautiful in the pan, but yeah, for some reason it doesn't translate on the eyes at all, and it just doesn't work for me at all, so that's why it's my least favorite shade. And there you have Soul swatched out on my hand. Again, I think the swatch of it is beautiful, but yeah, it just doesn't work for me. Next up we have the Soft Glam palette, and in here I'm gonna be boring enough and pick the black as my least favorite shade. I'm very much a person that doesn't use black very often, and apart from that I think I actually really like every shade. I mean, Cypress Umber I chose as my least favorite shade in the Modern Renaissance palette, so it's not an absolute favorite, but yeah, Noir is the only one that I really don't like in this palette. And there you have Noir swatched on my hand. It's just a regular black. So next up we have the Sultry palette, and in here it was a bit harder again to pick a least favorite. I could have gone with Noir again, but I don't want to go with the same shade. So the one that I'm actually thinking I'm going to go for is Slate, and this is quite similar to Soul. That I actually like the idea of it, and I do find that it can have some uses, but it's really hard to work with and find looks that it suits. So that's why I'm going to choose Slate. It's just a difficult shade to incorporate in my looks, and I feel like if I want to go for like a really cool toned turquoise shade, Twig right here is really good because it still has some brown to it and it's not completely cool toned. And there you have Slate on my hand. The final one of my Anastasia palettes is my Amrezy palette, and again I do like most of the shades in here. I feel like I could have gone with the black, but I do want to kind of think outside the box, because it would be boring to just have loads of black on my hand. So I could have picked one of the pressed glitters easily, but I'm not going to include pressed glitters in this video because I'll probably pick those for every palette where I have pressed glitters in. So I'm going to skip over those, and the shade that I decided to go with is Hugo on the end right here. And there you have Hugo. I think this is one that I don't absolutely hate. I think the undertone of this one is really nice, but it is my least favorite in that palette. So we're going to start going through my 9-pan palettes from Colourpop, and the first one we have to go through is Going Coconuts. So in here it was really easy for me to pick my least favorite shade, and that is the shade Get Crackin' right here. I do love the tone of it, but it's just a matte with silver sparkles in, and there's a lot of silver sparkles in there, so that's why it's my least favorite shade. I just don't like those formulas. It does work in some specific shades, but with this one it's almost too sparkly to use in the crease, and I just rather use an intense kind of shimmer on the lid rather than a sparkly matte. And there you have that shade. I'm hoping you can pick up the sparkles on camera. Next up we have the Mar palette, and in here again it was really easy for me to pick my least favorite shade, and that is the shade Detour right here. I rarely use matte blues. If I ever go for a blue, it's probably going to be like a shimmer blue on the lid paired with more neutrals or like greens and stuff like that, because I don't reach for blues very often. So this is my least favorite shade in this palette. There you have the Mar shade, and as you can see it is a beautiful blue, so if you do like blues I think you will like this one, but yeah, it's just something I don't reach for often. So from the It's My Pleasure palette we're gonna go with my first shimmer, and the one I decided to go for as my least favorite shade in here is the shade Chiclet in here. This shade in here, Pretty Cruel, is similar to the one in Gone Coconuts, that it has glitter in it and it's a matte shade, but the glitters aren't as intense as the Gone Coconut shade, so I can make that work, and I really love the tone of that eyeshadow. But I never really reach for deep kind of shimmers like this, especially not deep purple. I just feel like they're very kind of intense and it's not really a look that I go for often, so that's why I have picked this shade. So there you have the next shade swatched out on my arm. So next up we have my Mint to Be palette, and in here it was actually really hard for me to pick a least favorite shade. There's not really a lot of shades that I absolutely love, but there's also not a lot of shades that I don't really like at all. So the shade I decided to go with in here is the shade Seltzer right here, and that is again because it is a matte with sparkles in it. Similar to this My Pleasure palette, they're not really that significant, so you can make it work, but if I had to pick a least favorite shade, it would be that one. And there you have the shade from Mint to Be, and I'm hoping you can see on camera that the sparkles in this one isn't as significant. Staying on the greens, we're gonna go to Just My Lack from Colourpop again, and in here the shade I'm gonna go with is Kiss My Ass right here. I don't think it's anything wrong with that shade. I actually love all the shades in this palette. It's just my least favorite, and I did try to use this palette, I think it was 10 or 15 times in a project pan, and that was the shade that I reached for the least. And yeah, it's just not my favorite, and I feel like I can create a similar look as this shade if I mix like this one with this one or something similar, so that's why I'm picking that shade. I do think it has a slight shimmer to it, but I wouldn't say it's a matte with glitter in it. It's the shade in here that I feel like is most unnecessary, and that's why I'm picking it. And there you have the next shade swatched out. Next up we have the Hani Palette, and in here again, if I could go with pressed glitters, I would definitely choose Palooza. I do work pressed glitters sometimes. I am careful though, and I never wash it on the drain. I always use tape to get it off. But I just don't really love that they have pressed glitters in palettes, so I would have taken this out. But excluding this, like I said, because yeah, I just feel like that would be a given. The shade that I feel like is my least favorite is actually Stinger right here, which is the lightest shade in the palette. And the reason for that is because all of the other shades I do love, and I feel like they all kind of does different things, and there's like slight different tones, and there's nothing really that I want to get rid of. So why I chose this one is because I don't really set down my base anymore, and these shades are light enough to not need it to be blended out with a lighter shade, so that's why I'm picking the shade Stinger. So there you have Stinger swatched out on my arm. The second to last of the 9-pan palettes that I have is the Soul palette, and in here this is actually a palette that I'm currently working on in a project, so I have been reaching for this a lot. I do love most shades in here, and I feel like they all have a use. I think the one that I use the least is probably the shade in the middle, which is Motel, but I don't want to pick that one. So I think the shade I'm actually gonna go for is this shade right here, Anthem, because I think it's kind of deceiving in the palette, and that's why I'm picking it, because it looks more like cool tone, but I think it's just because it's surrounded by so many warm tones, so I'm always kind of misled in a way when I use that one, so that's why I'm going to pick that shade. So there you have the shade from the Soul palette, and I actually think it's a stunning shade, but I do love all of the shades in this palette, so I just chose one that I always have kind of difficulties because it turns out differently than I expect. Next up we have the Lilac You A Lot palette, and this is the last of the 9-pan palettes, and this is again one that is really hard for me to pick a least favorite shade in, because I do love most of these shades. I actually love all of them, I would say. The one I am going to pick as my least favorite shade is the shade Trainwreck, and I do actually love this shade because it has a beautiful shift to it. It's almost like a greyish blue with a like lilac shift to it. But the reason why I'm choosing it is because it's not very intense. The shimmer isn't, like I said, it's not very impactful, so that is why I'm picking the shade, but I do still think it's stunning. And there you have that shade swatched out on my arm. So we're continuing on with Colourpop. I have a few more palettes to go, and the first palette that we're going to go through is the Through My Eyes palette. And I talked about in my last video that this is one of my absolute favorite palettes from Colourpop, so it's really hard again to pick a least favorite shade, but it's similar to a few others that I mentioned before, and the shade I'm going to pick is the shade here called Candela. It's just a matte with glitter, and that's why I'm picking it. I think that's the only shade in here that I don't kind of like. I still like the tone of it, I still think it's a useful shade, but just those glitters are so annoying, and I just wished Colourpop stopped putting them in their mattes, but that is why I'm picking that shade. And there you have that shade, and again this is kind of similar to the one in the Golden Coconuts palette, in that the glitters are a bit more prominent. So the next palette that we have is my She palette, and as I mentioned as well, this one is kind of a mix between two palettes, and I took my favorite shades from two palettes and morphed them into one. So this is again one that is quite hard for me to pick a favorite, because of course these are all favorite shades between 24, so I picked my top 12. So all of these I kind of like, but again the one I'm going to choose is the one here. I don't know what shade this was. I think it was one from the Elemental Surprise palette originally, but this is this light kind of cream shade, and the reason why I'm picking it again is just because it's the most boring shade in the palette, frankly. So that's why I'm picking that shade. I do love all of the other ones. And there you have that shade swatched out on my arm. 5 more to go from Colourpop, and the next one is Dream Street. In here again I have a clear favorite, and surprisingly it's actually one that I already have pan on, and that is Sweet Dreams right here. The reason why I don't like it is because it's very glittery, and I do like the idea of it because it has a lot of glitters, it's very shimmery, but it just does the way to nothing. So it's really hard to get an impact on the lids, and I always have to apply it wet, but then again the impact wasn't really worth it. So this is probably the biggest that I have in my Colourpop collection, so this was an easy choice to make. And there you have that shade swatched on my arm. Next up we have my Yes Please palette, and in here again it was quite easy to pick my least favorite, and that is this shimmer shade right here. I don't really reach for these really dark reddish coppery tones anymore, and if I do, it's very rare. So that is my least favorite shade in this palette. There was a few contestants, but that is the one that I decided to go with. So there you have the swatch of that shade on my arm. The next palette up is the Give It To Me Straight palette, and in here again it was a bit harder to pick my least favorite because they are kind of all mid loves for me. Like I said in my favorite video, it was quite hard for me to pick the favorite because nothing really stands out to me, and I feel like it's kind of the same the other way around as well. But the one I decided to go with is this darker shade here again, similar to the ones that I picked initially. I just don't reach for these really dark shades that often, and if I do, they need to be something special, and yeah, this one is not it. And there you have that shade on my arm. So the second to last of my Colourpop palettes is my Sweet Talk palette, and this is one of my favorites from Colourpop. I mentioned that before. And again in here I probably would have gone with one of the pressed glitters initially, but the shade I'm going to go with is actually the one that I have pan on, and I do like this shade, but similar to some of the other ones that I've picked, I don't really reach for these shades that often, and this is also slightly too dark for me to use to set down my eyelids. So when I use this to kind of blend out my clear shade, and yes, that is helpful, but it's not very exciting, and yeah, I could do without that in a palette. And there you have that shade. I'm not even sure if you can see anything on my arm, it's quite close to my skin tone. And then the very last palette from Colourpop is the I Think I Love You palette, and in here again there are a few shades that I could have picked, for example this black, but again I picked a few other really dark shades, so I didn't want to go with that one. The other one I don't really love is this shade right here. It's just too dark of a shimmer for me, and that's why I don't love it. I do kind of also feel like there's a lot of kind of mid-tone darker shimmers in here, and if I want to go for like a darker smoky eye, I could still go for like this one or even these two, but this one is just slightly too dark. And then you have the last shade for this arm. So now moving on to the other palettes, we're gonna move arm because I'm running out of space again, and this is what I did last time. So I'm gonna move on to this arm right here and pick some of my least favorite shades from the rest of my palettes. So we're gonna move into Juvia's Place now, and the first palette I have is the Masquerade mini palette. In here I can kind of feel like I like most of the shades, but if I would have to pick one, it would probably be the shade Bori right here, because again it is a matte with glitter, and it's just this really hot pink color. So this one here is also one that is similar to that. It is also a matte with glitters, but I would rather reach for this color compared to this one, so that's why I'm choosing the shade Bori. And there you have the first swatch for this arm. Next up we have the Magic Mini palette, and in here I instantly knew which shade I was... Holy crap! I just lifted off this palette and this shade just fell out, so I'm gonna put that on the side because it's not my least favorite shade and I can glue that back in later, but I instantly knew which shade I was gonna go for as my least favorite shade, and there is this shade Aya or Aja, not sure how you pronounce it, but it's just this really dark shimmery forest green, and yeah, it's not a color that I reach for very often, so that is why I chose this one. So there you have that shade, and you can see it's almost black on my hand. Next up we have my Siharan 2 palette, and this is the palette where it again was really hard to pick my least favorite because I do like all of these shades, but the one I decided to go with is the shade Fez right here, because there are 3 kind of matte browns, and they look quite dark but they are very buildable. That's where I come in when it comes to the Juvia's Place formula, but the reason why I picked this one is because it's the least exciting out of the browns for me, and yeah, that's the only reason really. I do love all of these shades and I would rather not have picked any of them, but if I have to go with one, it's going to be this one. And there you have that shade on my hand. Next up we have the Deuce palette, and in here again I knew which shade to go for because I do love, I think, every other shade, but the only one that I don't really reach for is the shade Chocolate right here. It's just a deep brown, and as you notice in this video, those aren't my favorites. And there you have that shade on my hand. The last palette from Juvia's is the Tri palette, and again this is a palette that I really love. When it comes to my least favorite shade in this palette, I'm actually going to pick the shade Curla, I think it's called, and it's this shimmery orange right here. I do think it's a stunning shade, but the reason why I picking that shade is because this palette I love because of the greens. I love the greens in here so much, and I never really reach for the oranges in here when I do reach for it. Potentially I reach for this one sometimes to mix with like this kind of bronzy shade, but I barely ever reach for this orange shade, so that is why I'm picking it. And there you have it swatched on my hand. It's actually a beautiful shade, and it's a shame that I had to put it in my least favorite eyeshadows. So those were all of the Juvia's Place palettes. We're gonna move on to Urban Decay next, and the first palette that we have is the first Urban Decay Ultimate Naked Basics palette, and this one, yeah, like I said, it's just the original one. I've had this for ages, and as I mentioned in the first video where I did my favorite shades, this is not a very exciting palette, so a lot of these could have gone into this category, and for example I would have picked any of these over the last shade that I swatched, but that's just how palettes go. But my least favorite shade in this palette is the kind of dark, I don't know if it's a dark like brown or a black. It's called Cream, but that is my least favorite shade in this palette. And there you have the swatch of that one. It's actually a really pigmented black. I think it's black now when I swatched it on my arm, but it's very pigmented, so if you're looking for a good black, that is definitely it. Next up we have the original Naked palette, and in here we have the first shade that I ever felt real big dislike towards, and that is the shade Gunmetal. In here I just never got around to liking these shades. I think I like it a bit more now than I originally did, but it has to be that shade because yeah, it was the first eyeshadow that I ever tried that I just like thoroughly disliked, so that is why I'm picking Gunmetal. I could also have picked Creep because it's a black with shimmer in it, not my favorite, but I'm gonna go with Gunmetal just for the nostalgia. And there you have that shade swatched on my hand. Next up we have my Naked 3 palette, and in here again I instantly knew what shade to pick, and that is the last shade in the palette called Blackheart. It is again like a black with shimmer. This time the shimmers are purple. I like the idea of this. I think it could look stunning, but I just never reach for them, and I never can make them work the way I want them to, so that is why I'm picking this shade. Like quickly, if you look here, it looks stunning and like reflective and things, but I just never feel like it shows up that way on the eyes, so that's why I'm picking this. And there you have Blackheart swatched out on my arm. The last Urban Decay palette that we have is the Naked Ultimate Basics, and in here the shade I'm going to go for is this one right here, which is this grey shade. Again, it's not a very exciting palette, but if I would have to pick one shade that is my absolute least favorite, it would be that one, so that is why I'm picking this shade. So I only have 5 palettes to go. The next one is my Charlotte Tilbury Easy Eye palette in the shade Charlotte Darling, and again, as I mentioned in my first video, I haven't actually tried this on my eyes, so this again is just going to be me kind of eyeballing the shades, but again I used to have to go with the darkest shade because these are the shades that I reach for the least in palettes. And there you have that shade swatched on my arm.
You've got a lot of shades on your arm there.
Yeah, you can tell the difference from yesterday, can't you? I don't like dark shades so much.
Definitely.
Next up we have my Dose of Colors Francation palette, and this is what it looks like. And again, I already knew what shade I would pick for my least favorite, and that is this shade right here. It's just like this dark shimmery black shade, and I do like the effect. These kind of shimmery shades in here are absolutely stunning, and I don't really have anything else like them in my collection, but I don't really like this shade. If I want to go for like a dark impactful shade, I would either go for this blue or this green right here. The blue is slightly darker, but yeah, I would go for those two over this black one any day, so that is why I'm picking this one. And as you can see, that is the swatch of it, and it's very beautiful, but yeah, I don't really reach for it very often. Next up we have my Natasha Denona Metropolis palette, and in here again it was really hard for me to pick a least favorite shade because I think all of these are stunning, but the one I decided to go with is this kind of taupey shade right here, because I don't reach for those tones very often and I don't feel like that is anything special. For example, they have one here as well which is also like a taupey shade, but it has like a green slight shift to it. So I would much rather go for that one over this one anytime. And there you have that swatched on my arm. So we're down to the last two palettes, and they're both from I Heart Revolution. We're gonna start with this one, which is my Panda palette for this year. That is why it looks so battered. But my least favorite shade in here could be one of these two, but the one I'm gonna go with is this one. Again, because I don't really reach for those dark browns, but there's also another brown in here which I do prefer. So I would much rather just reach for this one, and I think this is a bit excessive to have. And there you have that shade swatched on my arm. And we finally have the very last shade, which comes from the Rose Gold palette from I Heart Revolution again. And this is what it looks like. In here, it was easy again to pick my least favorite shades. I feel like I've had an easier time picking my least favorite shades than my favorite shades. But the one I decided to go with is this kind of grey tone right here. It's definitely more wearable than some other kind of grey tone shades that I've had in earlier. But it's still my least favorite in this palette. And there you have the final swatch. I feel like my swatching game has gotten way worse at the end of this video, but yeah, that is the very final shade. So those are all of the shades in this update. I'm going to insert first the slideshow of these shades, and then I'm going to insert the slideshow comparing it to my favorite shades. But I feel like it's definitely a clear difference. Instantly, I feel like you can tell a difference between this and my last kind of round. There's definitely more mattes this time, and also much darker shades, and I feel like that's mainly the two differences. Also there's less kind of textures here, and yeah, I definitely feel like there's some shades in here that I definitely would love to wear on my eyes. But that kind of just proves that some palettes have just shades that I absolutely love, or at least like, whereas other palettes have more shades that I don't really love. But there you guys, that's all for this video. I really hope you enjoyed this little mini series, and if you did, please go ahead and give this video a thumbs up, and let me know if you are planning to do this, and if not, just pop down some of your favorites and least favorite shades down below. It would be interesting to know what you think. But otherwise, I hope you're having an amazing day, and I will talk to you in my next video. Bye guys.